What if everything you believed about fasting and inflammation was only giving you half the picture? You have been putting in the work every single day. You skip breakfast. You push through the hunger. You stay disciplined when everyone around you is eating. Every expert, every article, every podcast told you fasting would cool inflammation, burn fat, and transform how you feel. And maybe for a while, it actually did work. You felt sharper, lighter, more in control. But then something quietly shifted underneath the surface without you even noticing it happening. You started waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning, completely alert, heart racing, unable to fall back asleep. Your energy stopped being predictable. Some days you felt wired. Other days you crashed completely before noon. Your mood started shifting in ways that felt disconnected from anything actually happening in your life. You felt anxious and restless during fasts that used to feel clean and effortless and almost meditative. Here is what nobody in the fasting space is openly talking about right now, and the newer science is finally exposing it. Fasting does reduce inflammation while the fast is actually happening. That part of the story is completely true. But what happens to one very specific hormone during your fast is where the entire picture changes dramatically. And if you do not understand this piece, you could be quietly undoing every single benefit you are working toward. That hormone is cortisol, and its relationship with fasting and inflammation is far more complicated than most people ever explain. By the time this video ends, you will know exactly why cortisol rises every time you fast. No exceptions. You will understand why that rise, if it never gets properly shut down, starts creating inflammation instead of reducing it. Most importantly, you will have a precise, research-backed strategy to capitalize on cortisol and then turn it completely off. I am also going to walk you through the specific supplements I personally use when my cortisol is running too high, and I will share exactly what I do to protect my sleep during high-stress periods. Stay until the end. It matters. Let us start with the most fundamental question. Why does cortisol rise every single time you fast, no matter the method? When you stop eating, your insulin levels drop. That is actually the entire point of fasting. Low insulin unlocks fat burning. But your body does not simply sit back and enjoy the metabolic benefits you are working to create. Your body is wired for survival above everything else. It is scanning for threats every single second of every day. From a pure survival standpoint, not consuming food reads as a threat, a signal that something may have gone seriously wrong. So your body immediately deploys its emergency fuel manager. That manager is cortisol, and it takes its job very seriously. Cortisol during a fast is actually doing something genuinely heroic in the short term. It is keeping you alive and functional. It signals your liver to release stored glucose into the bloodstream so your brain and organs continue operating without interruption. It encourages your body to break down fat, and in some cases even muscle, into usable fuel sources. It prevents your blood sugar from crashing to dangerous, destabilizing levels while you are going hours without eating anything. Without cortisol rising during a fast, the whole process would become dangerous very quickly. Cortisol is not your enemy here. Let that fully land for a moment. The internet has worked incredibly hard to make cortisol sound like pure biological poison. That is not accurate. Cortisol is a tool, a survival mechanism. The problem is never the hormone, it is the timing. A study published in Endocrinology and Metabolism looked at multiple different fasting approaches all at once in the same research. They examined alternate day fasting, the 5-5-2 method, time-restricted eating windows, and standard intermittent fasting protocols. What they found across every single method was striking and important. One hormone was consistently and significantly affected every time: cortisol. Not just in some methods, not just in longer fasts. In every single fasting approach they studied without exception. And here is the part that changes everything. Cortisol does not simply turn off the moment you start eating again. It lingers. It carries over. It keeps running even after insulin starts rising again from your first meal post-fast. That carryover effect is where the real damage begins to quietly accumulate over days, weeks, and months of consistent fasting. Now let us talk about why elevated cortisol that never properly shuts down starts becoming a serious inflammation problem. Cortisol was designed by your biology to be a short-term emergency response. Crisis happens, cortisol rises, crisis resolves, cortisol drops. That is the healthy rhythm. Rise, fall, recover, reset. It is elegant when it works the way it is supposed to. But what happens when the cortisol never fully resolves? What happens when it stays elevated long after the fast has ended? You end up with chronic stress at a hormonal level, even if your life feels perfectly calm and manageable on the surface. And chronic stress, as the research is absolutely clear about, is one of the most powerful inflammation drivers in the human body. We are not talking about the inflammation of a sore muscle or a swollen ankle after an injury. This is deeper. This is systemic inflammation, the kind that quietly damages blood vessels, disrupts hormonal communication, and accelerates dangerous fat accumulation. The kind that sets the stage for the exact metabolic and cardiovascular problems most people start fasting specifically to prevent. A 2021 study published in Nutrients analyzed 14 separate fasting studies spanning everything from Ramadan fasting to clinical protocols. The common thread across every method that created problems was not simply elevated cortisol. It was dysregulated cortisol rhythms. People were waking up completely wired at 3 or 4 in the morning, unable to fall back into restorative sleep. Then they were crashing hard in the afternoon, unable to maintain energy or focus through the second half of their day. Their cortisol curve had essentially been flipped upside down from what human biology is designed to operate on. Here is why that disruption matters so much. Cortisol is supposed to peak in the early morning hours, around 6 to 8 a.m. That peak is called the cortisol awakening response. When it happens at the right time, it is a genuinely powerful event. It sharpens focus, it drives fat oxidation, it energizes the body, and sets the hormonal tone for your entire day. But when fasting pushes that peak to 3 a.m., because your body thinks it is still in a fuel emergency, you miss it. You wake up already depleted. Your body burned through its cortisol reserves while you were supposed to be deeply sleeping and recovering. And then you spend the whole day running on empty, wondering why fasting suddenly feels harder than it used to feel. Chronically elevated cortisol also keeps blood glucose running higher than it should be, and this part surprises most people completely. You are not eating any sugar. You are not consuming any carbohydrates. But your blood glucose is still elevated and staying that way. That is because cortisol is directly triggering your liver and muscles to release stored glucose into your blood around the clock. Persistently elevated blood glucose, even without a single dietary carbohydrate, is a well-documented, direct driver of systemic inflammation. You have essentially created an internal stressor that your body cannot distinguish from the stress of actually eating poorly around the clock. There is one more piece to this that makes the situation even more metabolically damaging when cortisol does not get shut down. When cortisol is high and you eventually eat, particularly when you eat fat or anything that drives insulin alongside cortisol, the hormonal environment shifts sharply in favor of fat storage, specifically the most dangerous kind, visceral fat around your organs. The exact fat you are working so hard to eliminate through disciplined fasting can accumulate faster when cortisol loops stay open. So the question that actually matters here is straightforward. How do you fix this? How do you close the cortisol loop? The answer is going to feel counterintuitive, especially if you have spent years in the fasting and low-carb space. The one hormone that can directly signal your body to stand down from a cortisol stress response is insulin. When insulin rises, even briefly, it communicates directly to the hypothalamus that fuel has arrived and the emergency is over. The hypothalamus then signals the pituitary gland. The pituitary signals the adrenal glands. Cortisol production eases off. Loop closed. It is a direct, elegant, built-in off switch for the stress response. And what raises insulin? Carbohydrates raise insulin. That is it. Before you close this video, I completely understand how that sounds given everything the low-carb fasting world has been teaching. It feels like a contradiction. It might feel like everything being walked back at once. It is not. The distinction matters enormously. We are not talking about adding carbohydrates on top of your normal caloric intake during your normal eating window. We are talking about strategically placing a small, targeted dose of carbohydrates specifically at the end of your fast. The purpose is singular. Produce a brief insulin signal strong enough to tell the hypothalamus the emergency is completely over. 20 to 40 grams. That is the range the research points to. Something clean and fast-acting is what works best here. A tablespoon or two of raw honey, a small piece of fruit, a bit of molasses. Something simple, not a full meal. Just enough insulin signal to communicate to your hypothalamus that fuel is available and cortisol can finally stand down completely. And here is the part that genuinely surprised me the most when I first went deep into this research area. You can actually do this in the middle of a longer fast and not destroy the metabolic benefits you have built. If you are 15 hours into a 20-hour fast and you feel genuinely frazzled, wired, anxious, and stressed, pay attention. Those are not signs of discipline. Those are cortisol signals telling you the stress response has been running far too long. 10 to 20 grams of a fast-acting carbohydrate source at that point is not going to undo your fast or erase your progress. Your insulin will rise briefly, then drop back down quickly as your body processes that small carbohydrate input and moves on. You will have interrupted the cortisol spiral without fully breaking the fasted state or losing the fat-burning benefits still in play. There is even emerging research showing that small carbohydrate pulses during extended fasts can actually enhance a molecule called FGF21. FGF21 is a metabolic signaling molecule that increases fat oxidation and supports the kind of metabolic flexibility fasting is supposed to build. Done correctly, this approach does not weaken your fast. It can actually make your fast more effective and more sustainable over time. But the most critical and consistent application is at the end of every fast, make this a non-negotiable part of your routine. Break your fast with 20 to 40 grams of quality carbohydrates first, before your full meal, every single time you complete a fast. Shut the cortisol loop down cleanly and intentionally before insulin and food interact with that still elevated stress hormone in your system. That simple sequencing shift could be the difference between fasting that genuinely reduces inflammation and fasting that quietly sustains it. Now, here is what I want to be completely clear about. None of this means cortisol is something to fear or eliminate. Cortisol is a tool. Like every tool, the outcome depends entirely on when you use it and how you manage it afterward. In the early morning hours, ideally somewhere between 6 and 8 a.m., a strong cortisol peak is genuinely powerful and beneficial. It sharpens focus. It drives energy. It significantly enhances fat oxidation during fasted morning exercise and activity. It sets you up. If you work out in a fasted state during that natural morning cortisol peak, you are stacking two fat-burning signals powerfully together. That combination is not something to avoid. That is a metabolic advantage you can deliberately build your entire fasting schedule around. The problem is not the cortisol peak. The problem is the peak happening at 3 a.m. instead of 7 a.m. because of dysregulation. When that peak gets displaced, you spend it sleeping, or more accurately, not sleeping, instead of burning fat during your workout. You wake up flat and foggy instead of energized because the cortisol your morning was supposed to run on is already gone. The goal is not zero cortisol. The goal is owning the rhythm. High in the morning, declining through the day, low at night, fast in alignment with that rhythm. Use the morning peak deliberately. Shut the response down cleanly at the end of your window. Protect your evenings and nights as genuine recovery periods where cortisol is low and your adrenal glands can actually recalibrate properly. That is the complete picture. Not eliminating cortisol, but timing it, using it, and closing the loop before it closes you. Now let me share the specific compounds I personally add to my routine when my cortisol or inflammation levels are running particularly high. These are not permanent daily supplements for everyone. They are targeted tools I reach for during elevated stress and high-demand periods. The first is N-acetylcysteine, NAC, at 300 to 600 milligrams during periods when I feel my stress load is genuinely high. NAC is a direct precursor to glutathione, which is the body's master antioxidant and one of its most important cellular defense compounds. When cortisol stays chronically elevated, oxidative stress rises alongside it in a pattern that compounds and accelerates biological damage. NAC gives your body the raw material to build its own internal defense system against that oxidative damage and the inflammation it creates. I do not take it every single day. I reach for it when I feel compromised, extra stressed, overtrained, or running on poor sleep. Next is magnesium. Specifically magnesium glycinate or dimagnesium malate at 400 to 500 milligrams, and this one I feel strongly about. Magnesium is genuinely one of the most underrated compounds in the entire conversation around cortisol regulation and systemic inflammation control. It directly supports the body's ability to regulate cortisol output, improves insulin sensitivity, and calms the nervous system out of overdrive. Most people who fast regularly and do not supplement magnesium are running deficient, and that deficiency makes everything measurably worse over time. If there is one thing on this list you add first, make it magnesium. The research and the practical results are consistently compelling. Tryptophan is the next one. 500 to 1,000 milligrams, taken specifically at night before sleep rather than during the day. Tryptophan is the amino acid precursor to both serotonin and melatonin, two of the most critical compounds for parasympathetic nervous system recovery. When cortisol has been keeping you locked in sympathetic overdrive all day, tryptophan helps genuinely tilt the balance back toward rest. It does not sedate you artificially. It gives your body the building blocks to produce its own calming neurotransmitters at the right time. This is particularly valuable if your fasting routine has been disrupting your ability to fall asleep or stay asleep consistently. Spermidine is something I use very specifically on my higher calorie days when I have temporarily dialed back my fasting intensity. Sometimes fasting stress accumulates to a point where you genuinely need to give your adrenal system a break from the repeated demand. On those days when I am eating more and fasting less, spermidine helps me maintain some of the autophagy benefit I would otherwise lose. Spermidine is a polyamine compound that directly activates autophagy, the cellular recycling and repair process that makes fasting so biologically valuable. Using it on non-fasting days lets me preserve that cellular renewal benefit even when I am intentionally giving my stress response a rest. Black seed oil rounds out the stack, used sparingly and always cyclically, never as a daily indefinite supplement without breaks between periods. Black seed oil contains thymoquinone, one of the most potent natural anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds identified consistently across the research literature. It is genuinely powerful when it comes to reducing inflammatory markers and combating oxidative stress from chronic cortisol elevation and metabolic stress. The important caveat is that tolerance to its effects builds relatively quickly with daily use, faster than most people expect or realize. You cannot use it continuously every day and expect the same anti-inflammatory effect to persist. It will diminish if you do not cycle it. Use it for 3 to 4 weeks when inflammation feels particularly high. Then, take a complete break before using it again strategically. Now let us talk about sleep, because this is where so many people who fast aggressively are losing everything they are working to gain. Sleep and cortisol have a bidirectional relationship that most people dramatically and consistently underestimate in how much it actually matters. Poor sleep drives cortisol dysregulation. Cortisol dysregulation destroys sleep quality, and once you are caught in that cycle, it compounds fast. If you are fasting aggressively, training hard, managing life stress, and sleeping poorly, you are building inflammation faster than you are reducing it. No supplement stack, no fasting protocol, and no dietary intervention can fully compensate for chronically inadequate or fragmented sleep. Period. Glycine is the compound I return to most consistently and reliably for sleep quality support, and the research behind it is solid. Glycine functions as an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, meaning it directly calms neural activity rather than simply making you feel sleepy. It also improves sleep architecture, specifically increasing the time you spend in slow-wave deep sleep, where physical recovery and hormonal restoration happen. 3 to 5 grams before bed is the dosage range the research supports, and most people notice a meaningful difference within just a few nights. Glycine also has a well-documented effect on bladder function that significantly reduces nighttime waking to urinate, more disruptive than most people realize. Here is the piece about sleep that completely reframes why it matters so much in this specific cortisol and inflammation conversation. Your adrenal glands are not simply resting while you sleep. They are actively recalibrating cortisol sensitivity and preparing the next morning's hormonal response. When your sleep is fragmented, too short, or low quality, that recalibration process does not complete properly. You wake up already behind. You carry yesterday's cortisol dysregulation directly into today. And over weeks and months, that accumulation builds exactly the inflammation you are fasting to fight. Quality sleep is not a passive recovery tool. It is an active biological process that determines whether your cortisol rhythm resets correctly every single day. Protect it with the same intentionality you bring to your fasting window, your workout, and your nutrition. It is not optional if results matter. Let me now bring all of this together into something you can actually apply starting immediately, because the strategy is simpler than it might seem. Fasting remains one of the most powerful metabolic tools available to us. The research supporting it across multiple health outcomes is genuinely substantial. But fasting applied without understanding the cortisol loop is like driving a car with the emergency brake partially engaged the entire time. You are still moving forward. You are still getting somewhere. But you are creating friction and heat and damage that accumulates invisibly underneath. The cortisol loop is the missing variable that most popular fasting approaches completely ignore, and that omission is costing people real results. You fast, cortisol rises to do its job, and if you never close the loop, it keeps running long after it should have stopped. Running cortisol means running inflammation. Running inflammation means accelerated visceral fat accumulation and a hormonal rhythm drifting in the wrong direction. The fix requires almost nothing in terms of effort or cost. End every fast with 20 to 40 grams of quality, fast-acting carbohydrates. Give your hypothalamus the insulin signal it needs to officially declare the fuel emergency over, and cortisol production can stand down completely. Then, eat your normal meal in whatever nutritional pattern works for your body, your goals, and your lifestyle, without guilt or second guessing. Protect your morning cortisol peak by completing your fast before that window and using the peak deliberately for fasted exercise and fat burning. Guard your evenings and nights ruthlessly. Keep cortisol low in the hours before sleep. Use tryptophan and glycine to support the transition. Add magnesium consistently. Use NAC, spermidine, and black seed oil as targeted tools during periods of elevated stress rather than permanent daily habits. And above everything else, listen to what your body is actually telling you during your fasts without dismissing the signals as weakness. Feeling wired, frazzled, anxious, and sleepless during a fast is not evidence of discipline or metabolic superiority. It is a cortisol distress signal. That signal is your biology telling you clearly and specifically that the stress loop has been running too long and needs to be closed. Close it deliberately. Shut the loop cleanly. And then allow fasting to do exactly what it is genuinely capable of doing for you. Because when you manage cortisol correctly, when the rhythm is right and the loop closes when it should, fasting becomes extraordinary. The inflammation drops, the fat burning sharpens, the sleep deepens, the energy stabilizes. The whole system starts working the way it was designed. That is what optimized fasting actually feels like. Not the wired, frazzled, anxious version most people are unknowingly living with right now. The version where everything clicks, where the cortisol peaks when you need it, falls when you do not, and the inflammation finally quiets. That version is available to you. You just needed to understand the loop, and now you do. Go close it.